What's up, guys? We are finishing up our section on painting today. I apologize for getting this to you guys a little late. I'm going to compensate by condensing the originally planned 3 videos into 2. So we're going to finish up painting today. It might be a little longer. I apologize if you hear my dishwasher going on in the background. We finished off almost halfway, so I say without further ado, let's just get into it, huh? Okay. Let's see what we got here. To quote Gebser, "In all this, it must not be forgotten that the Cubist experiment is one of the numerous variations of temporic style preparatory to aperspectivity. On the one hand, it seems to destroy the forms, which is quite understandable since it dissolves three-dimensional space. On the other hand, it reverts, emphasis on time, that's a temporal space-time, it reverts to certain primordial forms and thereby quote-unquote presentiates them at the very moment it excludes the harmony of the human body from depiction. In this regard, it is noteworthy that particularly in and following Cubism, paintings frequently depict guitars, mandolins, and lutes." You should use a comma, Gebser. That's when you do that. Use a comma so I don't mess up the reading. Thank you, Jean. "We know today, on the basis of new research in symbolism, that these instruments symbolize the primordial form of the female body. They are to a certain extent its primordial image. The substitution of the primordial form of the human body, the nude, now taking place in modern art, the emphatic quote-unquote presencing of a primordial image, can be considered a further explanation of the hitherto latent temporic concern of modern painting." So what he's saying is the nude is the top, what's the word? It's the prototypical image of the mental structure. It's very important, but he's saying there's a shift now where no longer are we painting nudes, we're now painting guitars, mandolins, and lutes, and he's saying new research has showed that these guitars, mandolins, and lutes actually represent the female body, the primordial female form. So we have the nude of the female, which is obvious, right? We all kind of know what that looks like in art. But underneath that, in the same way that underneath the simple plant or the simple horse, Goethe is finding the primordial process, that Urpflanze, that each plant goes through. Same thing with Joseph Campbell in myth. They're finding the underlying process that, in the case of Goethe, each plant must undergo to essentially become a plant. Same thing in myth. Each myth must kind of undergo this to become a true myth. Well, there you go. We're finding a primordial image that is sort of underneath, and where the traditional nude image of the woman is an expression of a primordial image. So, pretty cool. From time to time, these temporic concerns have been clearly and distinctly articulated by individual artists. Theo van Doesburg, for example, called some of his quote-unquote abstract paintings, quote, space-time constructions, unquote. Other examples can be found among the Futurists some years earlier. We would mention only Gino Severini's Restless Dancer, and that's what this is. This is the Restless Dancer here. I'm going to try to... You see it? It's very cubistic, you can tell, because you can tell what it is. It is a woman, but it's aperspectival insofar as so many different perspectives have been integrated that it does destroy the traditional female form, but we can still understand what it is. Severini himself insisted that it deals with the total impression of the dancer, past and present, near and far, small and large, as they appear to the artist who has observed the dancer during various periods of her life. I'm going to repeat for emphasis. So this picture, this right here, this is aperspectival, right? So what is the aperspectival trying to do here? Well, let's see. Insisted that this picture deals with, quote, total impression of the dancer, past and present, near and far, small and large, as they appear to the artist who has observed the dancer during various periods of her life. I mean, that is a pretty great expression of integral consciousness. You also see this with the aperspectival whole, like this idea of we need the feminist perspective. We need the African American or black perspective. We need the Asian perspective. That's what we're trying to do. The left, I guess, has decided that the only straight white male perspective has been privilege. I think that's a bit silly, but that's not the point of this. And what we need, that's one perspective that is a fragment of the whole, but what we need is to round out this whole with all the perspectives from these other identities. So it's the same thing with art. That's what they're trying to do culturally when they have, and politically, when they have this idea of, well, we need other perspectives. They're trying to, the total impression, not of the dancer in this case, but of whatever it is we're considering, past and present, near and far, small and large, as they appear to the artist who has observed the dancer during various periods of her life. So there you go. Okay, now we're going to move on to number 2, the supersession of dualism. The application of color complementarity by Delacroix is a secession from opposites, from dualism, and a movement towards correspondence, towards polar complementarity. These are not merely contrastive effects of color played off against each other. Rather, the painting obtains the vigor from a polar nexus, from the interrelationship of the colors. The structure has undergone a fundamental change or transformation, and ever since Delacroix, the question of color complementarity has been unavoidable in painting. Not only Van Gogh, but most of the later masters sought out and worked with pure colors. At the very moment when Einstein resolved the opposition of matter versus energy, the Fauvists made a demand ultimately traceable to Cézanne that the painting should be form and or line and color. So we have the form, which is the line. We talked about that. That's the what's the word? The real anchoring artistic thing. I don't have the language at my disposal for the artist. I apologize. But the line, of course, was very important. But what we saw last week, of course, the line, which constitutes the triangle, which is the prototypical symbol of the mental structure, of course, is now curved. So it's a curved line, if you even want to call it that. So it can round out a sphere. So in addition to the form and or line, we also have color. So I think this does kind of put into perspective Gebser. Remember my criticism of Gebser last week, where on one hand he was criticizing Mach because he was regressing to the 2D flat circle cyclic temporality, but then on the same time he's appealing to complementarity and this sort of cyclical temporality here. And I think this line actually really does help because it says form and or line and color. So I think if the criticism of Mach was you are exclusively focusing on the mythical, then yes. But I guess it's not really a criticism here because the regression in this case, which is, say, the regression from the line to the use of complementary colors, is not a regression so long as the line retains its efficacy and presence, because that, of course, is rounding out the aperspectival whole. In this, there is a notable parallelism between physics and art, and in both it is rooted in the need to realize a new perception of the world. Yeah, so that was cool. At the very moment when Einstein resolved the opposition of matter versus energy, the Fauvists made a demand ultimately traceable to Cézanne that the painting should be form and color. So in the same way that it went from space and time to space-time, now we have form and color to form color. And also, you see this in contemporary art. I remember once it was on, maybe a year or two ago, there was a post this artist made. It was just a surface of just red, and it was a lot of different hues of red. And I remember the comment, the caption was something like, if you need it explained, you just don't get it. And it started this big conversation, and we're going to touch on that in a second. The preoccupation with overcoming dualism is reflected in painting in yet another way. Insofar as we can judge, it became, this is super cool. Insofar as we can judge, it became acute for the first time with Cézanne. We must not forget that a painting is constantly experienced as an opposite. It was an object for its creator as well as for the observer. So when we're making a painting, when I'm painting the Mona Lisa, the painting is an object that is separate from me. I am creating the painting, right? There is a dualistic antithetical enfrainment between me and the painting. The painting is something I created, yes, but ultimately it is separate from me. This is rationality, baby. Liliane Guerry logically concludes that on the basis of Cézanne's inclusion of time, quote, the boundaries between the space of the observer and the space of the work of art are eliminated. One identifies and harmonizes with the other, unquote. The concluding deduction which Liliane Guerry draws from her investigations points to this same phenomenon, underscored, moreover, by a statement of Cézanne's, quote, just as the artist has surpassed time by integrating himself into its rhythm, which is a swimming in the current of time, not trying to use it as a tool that you can, that's fine, you can use things as tools, you can use a hammer and all that stuff as a tool, that's great, that's because it's rationality. Time is not a tool. Integrating himself into its rhythm, so he is from now on the master of space, and only now can he say in summary, I feel colored by all the nuances of the infinite, henceforth I am one with my painting. Of course, if you want to know about this, I'll explain it a little bit, but we've already kind of talked about this. Integrating himself into its rhythm. You could do this in a couple different ways. So, of course, the temporal unfolding could be linear and sort of long and something to be realized later on, like think of cashing out retirement or something like that. In that case, if you want money and you want it now, that's fine. You're just going to have to readjust, right? Your retirement, for me personally, it's not going to come to what, like 35 years later? Okay, so it would be foolish to get myself in a tizzy and get all anxious every single day of my life about my retirement money. It's in the future. Let it go. Let it not let it go in the sense of don't think about it, but just realize, kind of recalibrate, and you say, I do have a desire for that money, but there is nothing in reality that's going to make it likely that I'm going to get it now. So why don't I readjust my temporal expectations and I can just play the long game? Where, on the other hand, if you're walking, like the other day I did this, I was driving by my old neighborhood, and I have some old friends over there. And it just, boom, just like that. I had a momentary like, hey, like it's Saturday, it's 3. Go stop in and see if they're talking, or see if they're home and you can talk. And that's exactly what I did. And I had a good conversation with my old friends. So in that case, the quickness, the suddenness of this, I integrated myself into its rhythm. So, which is to say that, hey, this opportunity isn't going to come all the time. Don't do the thing we just talked about where everything's the long game. Now you play the short game and go do that. That's integrating into its rhythm. It would definitely be counter, this is Gebser, it would definitely be counter to the attained frequency of consciousness if we were to interpret Cézanne's statement in mythical or psychological terms. We are dealing here, for those who have ears to hear, with a supersession of time and space, object and subject, with a liberation from them and a conscious participation in the whole. It has nothing to do with some mythical, magical immersion in a mere space timelessness, or with this mere psychologically inexplicable identification. So he's saying that Cézanne's statement does actually represent time freedom because we have a conscious understanding of how these work. It's not that they don't exist, it's just that we're not enslaved to them in the same way that we're not enslaved to rationalism. That's time freedom. Regressing into time doesn't exist and space doesn't exist and ego doesn't exist, that's a regression. To be sure, those who in their mental limitation and spatial captivity reiterate the cliche of the quote-unquote loss of the middle will be unable to recognize the new consciousness structure manifest in the adduced examples. Loss of the middle, very interesting. Let's see. Consciousness. Since the whole is space-time free, it knows no middle. Only in space and spatial thought is there a middle. Whoever applies three-dimensional criteria to the aperspectival, four-dimensional art of our day and speaks of the spatializing middle, whereas the whole, in its freedom from spatio-temporal concepts, is transparent, ill-advisedly stirs up controversy at the wrong time and place. The loss of the middle is not a loss, but a gain of the whole. So, of course, the middle, and what we have here, we have, of course, the rational way, one thing that's measurable, antithetically against another thing that's measurable and known. Well, there's a middle here. There's space. That's one way of looking at it. So that middle is filled by the reconciliation, right? That's one way of looking at it. Or you could look at, of course, the middle. That sounds like the vanishing point to me. And we all know how important the vanishing point is to rationality. It's as important to perspectivity. It is the invisible inferred point that confers clarity, order, and depth. That structures what follows from it by conferring clarity, order, and depth on whatever is encompassed visually. Same thing with rationality. So anyone who says loss of the middle, they're a rationalist. Don't worry about them. All right, let's see. Okay, so now we're going to skip ahead to point number 3 because there's really not much left in point number 2. So essentially we've surpassed dualism by retaining the efficacy of the line, which is rationality, while also integrating the polar complementary colors. Great, but again, I think Mach might have a word. Okay, so number 3, the irrationality of the new painting and indications more clearly demonstrating the aperspectival manifestations of this art. Excuse me. Okay. Oh, this is huge, by the way. Picasso's well-known remark, quote, "I do not seek, I find," unquote, expresses at the very least his irrational attitude. This is so important. This has been my new maxim, by the way. The second I read on page 480 for the first time, this is probably 5-6 months ago, the second I read that remark, that is my new life maxim. I do not seek, I find. I do not seek, I find. That when you seek, you are goal-driven, and if you are goal-driven, the goal belongs to the ego, and the ego belongs to the mental structure. This is not necessarily a bad thing, but what you're doing is you're going in, you're putting blinders on, and you're only seeing what you want to see. Rather, if you take a more an open approach, you can find whatever it is. So rather than trying to seek, which is to say trying to impose a system of ideas on reality, rather someone who's open, someone like Gebser, someone like Spangler, someone like Goethe, they'll say, no, I'll have that structure of reality revealed to me, and I'll do that by finding, not seeking. Seeking is not necessarily a bad thing, but it can be a bad thing if it's exclusively employed. Picasso did not necessarily go in his aperspectival paintings to seek to do the aperspectival stuff. That had to be revealed to him. So he had to be open from one perspective. Great. I've sought to paint the Mona Lisa from one perspective. Great. That's the rational way of doing things. Where Picasso says, no, I'll take this perspective and I'll find something. And then I'll say, this contour, this color, this whatever, it looks good here. Then I'm going to be open enough to find something else from another perspective. Same thing. Now, you can do this in interpersonal life too. Shut up and listen, okay? Because with the structures, now that you know the structures, when you're talking interpersonally, people will tell you what it is. Like, for example, remember that Sydney Sweeney American Eagle ad? I was talking to someone, and they were a leftist, but they were very against it. And they said that, I asked them why, because it seems so silly to me. But they said that essentially that ad expressed the traditional power structures that were evil and racist and all that stuff, and that was interpreted almost like a sign validating this idea. Notice what that person didn't say is anything really logical or rational. And I don't say that as an insult. I don't say that to be dismissive or to look down on them. I'm saying what they gave you is a story, a narrative about oppression, oppressor, right and wrong, all that stuff. Not necessarily a bad thing, but what do you think I did when I heard that? Okay, if I wanted to disagree, I didn't go at them with logic. I didn't seek, as the rationalists do, to go in there and impose my logical, rational way of doing things. Rather, I was open and allowed them to express what was important to them, and then I said, we're not dealing with the mental structure here, my friend. We're dealing with the mythical structure and the magical structure, so you need to hit that first. And you can't do that if you go in seeking and putting blinders on and saying, I'm going to seek only the mental structure. It's a big mistake. So yes, it is an amazing maxim. I do not seek, I find. It's simple, it's pithy, it's very easy to remember. Please adopt it on your own. It also helps, by the way, in just like basic strategy. Like I've noticed this in business. Like you have these amazing plans and these amazing 3-4 step plans. Like, how about we just do a 1 to 2 step plan? And instead of seeking to impose our system, we are open and we find the organic reaction of our employees. So if we implement part 1, great. Implement part 2, things don't go well. Well, now we have a choice here. What do? Are we open to having a moment-to-moment feedback system, emphasis on the time, and we are open to finding that no, perhaps our models didn't work in the way we thought it was, or are we going to be seeking to impose our shitty systems, and then the bosses don't get as productive workers, the workers start to get pissed off the bosses, then the business fails. So please adopt that maxim. Okay. To clarify this remark of Picasso, Werner Haftmann quotes Hermann Hesse. If search means that one has a goal, then finding means to be free, to stand open, to have no aim. Beautiful. In this context belongs the theory of figures of Ouvertes, Ouvertes, developed for landscape painting by André Lahaut with reference to Cézanne. It enables, quote, the false totally intellectual delineation or outline, unquote, of things to be replaced by connecting transitions. There you go. Here, too, we no longer find a purposive search, but an open understanding. The finder carries his goal within and need not seek it externally. Repeat. The finder carries his goal within and need not seek it externally. Of course, we know the mental structure was built from the external, that is, say, objectified space, whereas the mythical structure was born from the discovery of something internal, the soul, obviously. And of course, with the breathing polarity of these structures, magic was external, mythic was internal, mental was external, now we have the internal again. So there's a newfound emphasis. That's why Gebser says, we don't care about seeking approval from the external, because you guys are morons. In general, however, irrationality in painting, just as in other areas we have considered, is only a consequence, or rather, an encompassing circumscription of an attitude which becomes efficient when the quote-unquote eruption of time becomes efficacious. So Gebser is saying this necessarily must have happened because it's simply downstream from the structure of the integral structure, from the workings of the integral structure, in the same way that blueprints must necessarily have come about only with the mental structure. Same thing here. This efficacy brings about the supersession of dualism and perspectival rigidity. It transforms the three-dimensional space world into a spherical, four-dimensional space-time world. In painting, it opens the closed space in the same way as it opened closed thinking and closed justice. So there you go. Closed space in painting has been opened, just like, as he said, these other things that we've talked about, closed thinking in philosophy, closed justice in jurisprudence. Whereas mere systems were overdetermined into structures. In painting, the terms aperspectival and irrational coincide in the same way that atonal and irrational do in music. Pretty cool, in my opinion. All right, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. All artistic styles since Impressionism are spontaneous forms of temporic attempts to surpass the perspectival three-dimensionality by the inclusion of time. Let me repeat that. This is important. All artistic styles since Impressionism are spontaneous forms of temporic attempts to surpass the perspectival three-dimensionality by the incursion of time. Now, why would he identify Impressionism as that? Is it because the painting Impression Sunrise, which of course the movement derived its name, is it because perhaps that painting, and if you want to look it up on Google Images, I implore you to, is it because that said painting is not a traditional painting, but rather the capturing of a moment, emphasis on the temporal, which is why everything is so phasey and kind of foggy and not quite as clear, as perspectively clear as the traditional Renaissance paintings, is because we're capturing a moment, and the moment is quality, or I should say the moment is permeated by a particular quality, which is, say, time as a quality. That's why impression of a moment, emphasis on time. We're not just doing pure space. Pretty cool. Yet it becomes ever more evident from decade to decade that art is no longer concerned with things as such, abstract or concrete forms, imitative, prototypal, or archetypal art, but rather with the visual manifestation of structures lying quote-unquote behind and constituting things and thoughts. As Picasso has formulated this fact, quote, "It is not the facade of things, but their hidden structure," which is to say, it's not the facade of the external, quantifiably measurable and consciously known, but the invisible, four-dimensional intensities that round out the perception of the external. The hidden structure. In the humans, of course, this applies to the psyche. The psyche is hidden. It shapes. It is an intensity that shapes the external. Of course, we've already kind of touched on Goethean morphology. That applies to myth. That applies to art. That applies to biology. Applies to all these sorts of things. In psychology, we also have the consciousness structures. Another example. It is the identical concern with disclosing the interconnection of the whole through the spatio-temporal structure which we have repeatedly encountered. The emphasis on structure is today, for many of the best artists, the most prominent feature linking the various quote-unquote styles. This is also preparatory to attaining an open quote-unquote world without opposite. With this phrase, we do not mean a thou-less, relationless perception of world, but an unrestricted, delimited world that reveals to our perception the fullness and wealth of connections of the unobstructed whole. We're going to repeat that. So what he's saying is, this is preparatory to attaining an open world without opposites. That, for you guys this deep in this series, I would imagine you guys would know, well, opposites, that's antithetical, right? And that's obviously rationality. So what he's saying is, with this phrase, we're not regressing to irrational, pre-rational nonsense. That's not what Gebser is trying to do at all. He's trying to go forward. What he's saying is, we want an unrestricted, delimited world that reveals to our perception the fullness and wealth of connections of the unobstructed whole. So the unobstructed whole is a complementary phenomenon, and the enframement of it as dualistic oppositions was necessary for the mental structure, yes, but now let's return back to this complementarity. So that's all he means when he says a world without opposite. It's not a negation of the mental structure. That's not what he's talking about. He's saying the mental structure was a necessary projection made by the ego, and we are not enslaved to it. That's all. The quote-unquote loss of the opposite appears a loss only to those who lack assurance in the quote-unquote itself, and cannot dispense with the supposedly protective laws of their systems and the possessiveness of their rigidified ego. To surrender the opposite is to gain togetherness, genuine interhuman participation. In this togetherness, the thou, be it a partner, world, or the divine, is no longer thought, understood, or grasped as an opposite. Pretty cool. Pretty freaking cool. Subject and object lose their previous dualistic and antagonistic character of opposition, and the antagonism engendered by preserving a misunderstood ego valuation transforms itself into a creative tension emerging from the togetherness of life-sustaining and complementary poles. Beautifully put. The spatio-temporal structures appearing in contemporary painting dissolve the merely spatially fixed systems. The spatio-temporal structures appearing, yeah, and I'm going to, hold on. The systems retain their hold only where they make circumscribed areas of reality manipulable, as in science, technology, and necessarily discursive conceptual thought. It kind of reminds me when he says, appearing in contemporary painting, dissolve the merely spatially fixed systems. I think I might have mentioned this in the last video, but it does remind me of Rothko, this idea of the luminescent squares, which obviously in our world would be the computers and screens and laptops and all that, melting down perspectival order. Pretty cool. We must therefore not become confused by the innumerable names of styles, nor by their apparent contrariety. Impressionism dissolves form. Pointillism discloses the vibrations of space. The primitivist radically denounce perspective and attempt to break new ground from an infantilistic attitude. Fauvism masters a new relationship between line and color, that is, between space and time. Or, with reference to Paul Klee's definition of line and color, the artist masters the relationship between the quantitative, the measurable line, and the qualitative, color. So what he's saying is all these different artistic forms, they're all attempts to surpass 3D traditional mental rational art. Expressionism attempts an emotionally laden onslaught against the residua of a conception and depiction of the naturalistic three-dimensional world. Futurism, particularly cubism, forms inceptionally the new, spherically transparent structure of the world. Surrealism succumbs to psychic temporicity by approaching the time problem, not without impunity, from the puberty zone, embellished by the churnings of psychoanalysis. The so-called abstractionists, whose paintings could be more appropriately called structural, completely detach themselves from any form of palpable three-dimensional objectivity. What intense effort has been expended by the past 2 generations in their search for ways to express the new world perception. So again, all those little mini movements we talked about, that's what they're trying to do. They're attempting, a lot of them are failing because not all of them are Picasso, but they are attempting to realize the aperspectival whole. How many creative lives and their works have opened further avenues, or more exactly, have discovered new bases of departure, even with their mistaken attempts? How many failures to overcome perspectivity, which corresponds to the approximate number of false starts before the discovery of perspective during the generations preceding Leonardo da Vinci? How often a mistakenly chosen basis of departure has at least shown how the new consciousness structure cannot be realized, whether as the magical emphasis of the quote-unquote Sunday painters, the psychic emphasis of the surrealists, who merely sub-realistically flung from themselves their dream world and the psychic crises of the epoch based, or the emotion-ridden and thus equally psychic-dominated false starters of expressionism. In contrast, the later works of the major artists, notably those of Braque, Leger, Matisse, and Picasso, reunify all the elements shaped by the various attempts. Yep, Cézanne's spherical space, the abstraction, that is, the structuration of the futurists, cubists, and abstractionists, as well as some tachists. The pure color values that consolidated the Delacroix via Van Gogh to the Fauvist, and the disjunction pioneered by Cubism and Expressionism. So what he's saying is all those movements that we talk, Fauvism, Expressionism, abstract, all that stuff, what Picasso, Leger, Matisse, and all those guys did, they took the time to learn the perspectives of all of them and integrated them into a single image. So rather than just being expressionist, rather than just being abstractionist, rather than just being a Fauvist, I am all these things at once because I've taken the time to integrate them into a singular image. With these masters begins the realization of what Franz Marc articulated. Quote, more and more I begin to see behind, or better, see through things, which is the transparency that was very important in science. This transparency gradually becomes perceptible. Let's see. Here are some pictures of the light drawings from Picasso. These are trying to these primordial forms. Yep, not perspectively correct by any means. They're all kind of weird and out there. Yes, I understand they're not as pretty as Las Meninas, but at least we understand now what they're going for. Pretty cool. And I think what he's doing here is trying to do that primordial form. He's almost trying to paint like Goethe's morphology, which is pretty cool. All right, skip ahead a little bit. All these attempts make vivid the desire to step out of the previous framework. This desire is brought out with unusual force in one of the most important transparent pictures of Georges Braque, a picture of sunflowers. This picture I'm about to show you is one of the most, like, I don't even know. I'm almost at a loss for words how, like, unbelievably, just incredible this picture I'm about to show you is. It's so good. This pictorial surface, for which the rectangular frame is naturally inadequate, reaches into the frame, which is exploded and dissolved by the pictorial surface. Please, 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 please look at this. Okay, it might be difficult to see. I want you to look at, if you can't see it, it's this one right here. It's Georges Braque. It's called Sunflowers. If you cannot see it properly, I want you to Google images. What you see is a traditional 3D boxed-in, line-focused, rational construction that is the rectangular frame that Gebser was talking about, and the painting is literally overstretching. It's hanging over the painting. It is as if the 3D spatial framing cannot contain the spherical, integral 4D flowers, which stretch outside of the painting because no longer are they just external, but they have been intensified by their qualitative internal complement, causing them to balloon into the sphere and therefore outstretching or overstretching, breaking through the traditional boxed-in rational frame. The painting is outside of the frame. It's such an amazing, like, it's almost even better than Picasso's in terms of just an image that 100% represents 4D integral consciousness. It's so amazing. It's just, wow. And then this is cool too. You have some spheres. I mean, you see this all the time in like contemporary magazines. You see these spherical pictures. You're starting to see this a lot more in the 2010s and 20s. And that, again, that's we're changing the perspective. No, we're doing the kind of the, what do they call it? The fishbowl view or whatever. I thought that was super cool. Wow. That actually might be where we ended here. Actually, no, we'll do this. Okay, so pretty cool, huh? So we'll finish these last few paragraphs and then we'll end. These quote-unquote roots of the world, invisible to the mere eye, the quote secret structure of things, they have been brought to perception by Picasso and other artists of our epoch. And it also, as a reminder, it is funny that Gebser and Picasso had at least something of a friendly relationship. Because remember at the very, very, very beginning of this book, like we're talking like page 12 or whatever, he said he went and he asked Picasso, like, hey, is this what you were going for? And he goes, yeah, that's exactly what I was going for. So it's pretty cool that he could just walk down the hall to some extent and just be like, hey, is this it? We would mention particularly the paintings of Ernst Wilhelm Ney, whose agglomerations, spheroid and disk form, evoke subatomic events. Even Klee himself has revealed botanic microstructures. Hello, biology. Physics. Among others, Sophie Tabor Arp and Hans Hofenrichter followed his example. The painting by Sophie Tabor Arp, L'Ignace d'Et, evinces a remarkable structural affinity to a microphotograph of starch granules embedded in lacquer. Damn. All right, I'm going to skip it. This is bullshit. Although in Klee's work, a physical and at times magical emphasis prevails, he nevertheless successfully evokes the polyvalence and transparency of the whole. Of course, Picasso's pictures, such as his still-life paintings in Antibes, are more transparent, as are the contemporaneous works of Matisse and Leger. They all exhibit a common stylistic trait, the whiteness of the ground that integrates what is quote-unquote depicted, rendering it transparent. This is evident in Picasso's still-life vase with foliage and sea urchins, despite our black and white reproduction. All of these aperspectival inceptions clearly show the irrationality of modern painting. Even partial regressions, such as those of the first abstractionists, expressionists, and surrealists who strove to overcome three-dimensionality primarily from the psychic, lead beyond the irrational and the rational, as it is apparent in the late work of Klee and even of Kandinsky. Today, at the midpoint of the century, the words noted by Franz Marc in 1915 are coming to fulfillment. Quote, "In the 20th century, we shall live among strange faces, new paintings, and unheard-of sounds. Many, lacking an inner glow, will freeze and feel nothing but coolness, and will flee into the ruins of their recollection." Unquote. And that is the final sentence of this section. So then we are doing literature. That'll take at least 2 videos. At least. God, this is a long ass. Holy shit. Yeah, that's going to take 3 videos. This is way longer than the painting. Then we're done with the arts. Then we have the twofold task, which is say we're in the bottom 10% after this next section. So stick in there. We're getting it. All right. I love you guys. I appreciate you guys more than anything for continuing to stick in. And try to apply this in the world. You know, that always makes it. Also, another thing. When he said the multi... hold on. Hold on here. When he said... Hold on. It is the multipolar. Anyways, the whole point that we're not doing from a singular perspective, obviously we've discussed the importance of this. I think that applies politically, geopolitically, in terms of globalism. What do you hear from the Dugans of the world? They want a multipolar, which essentially what they're saying is a multi-perspectival, an a-perspectival world. I'm not even sure that's necessarily, I'm not saying that's right or wrong. I just think that's what it is, and that line kind of reminded me of that. I love you guys. I will see you guys next week, and be safe. I hope you guys are doing well.